All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to All Tech is Human Conversations. This is our inaugural event, so bear with us if there's any technical difficulty. But first off, given everything going on, and especially since we are talking about COVID-19, I do want to say that everybody watching in, thank you for tuning in. And also, more importantly, hopefully you and your loved ones and your community are safe. I know this is a highly stressful time, given everything that is going on. But again, with COVID-19 happening and really upending a lot of society, we thought with All Tech is Human, where we tackle the thorniest issues in tech society with a broad range of individuals across academia, industry, technologists, artists, designers, and others, we thought it'd be a good time to have a conversation about kind of the intersection of COVID-19, AI surveillance, and ethics. So I'm really excited today to have on two experts. We have Reid Blackman and also Renee Cummings. Both these individuals have been involved in the All Tech is Human community. For example, with Reid, we just did a interview. So if you feel like checking that out, you can go to alltechishuman.org. In addition, I think we'll be doing a lot more with Renee Cummings in the coming weeks. So really to kind of start things off, I do want to mention as a little bit of housekeeping that you can ask your questions either here in our stream. Also, this is going to Periscope and YouTube, also to our website, alltechishuman.org. You can also tweet at us. We're at alltechishuman, and we're also hashtag alltechishuman. We're going to monitor that as well. In addition, if you see me, I'm David Ryan Polgar. I'm the founder of All Tech is Human. If you see me popping off of this live stream, don't be worried. I'm actually just constantly giving more time and space and kind of for the live stream for Reid and Renee to have this great conversation, and also to allow you to participate online and for me to monitor that. And so you might see me jumping off screen and then jumping back on screen. So be prepared for that. So I think to get us started, I want to kind of hear from both of you just a little bit about your backgrounds, just so we have a little bit of context for the discussion. So Renee, if we start with you, could you tell everybody a little bit about who you are and some of the work that you're doing?
Oh, sure. I'm Renee Cummings. I'm a criminologist and a criminal psychologist. I work at the intersection of AI and national security. Over the last year, I've been doing a lot of work when it comes to AI ethics, of course, diversity, equity, and inclusion in AI. Beyond that, I'm a community scholar at Columbia University, and I am the Northeast Coast lead for Women in AI Ethics.
Terrific. That sounds great. So Reid, what about yourself?
I'm just some guy who wandered in here.
No, so I don't even know who you were. I think I just hit accept. I really shouldn't do that.
I knew you were going to say something like that. I just figured it out.
Right. There we go. Leave it up to Reid.
So my name is Reid Blackman. Yeah, my name is Reid of Virtue Consultants. It's an ethics consultancy. We focus on ethical risks, especially those associated with artificial intelligence. I also sit on Ernst & Young's AI advisory board, where I help them figure out how to vet products, AI products for ethical safety. Prior to founding Virtue, I was a philosophy professor where I specialized on ethics. And I've been teaching, researching, publishing on ethics for about 15, 20 years now.
And in hindsight, I guess I should have been a little more careful asking anybody with a philosophy background who they are. I know that could be potentially a deeper question. But to really kick off our conversation, Renee and Reid, I think it would be good to frame some of this discussion and also really get into some of the meaty conversation, because I do want to be clear. There has been obviously a lot of media attention around AI surveillance types of tools, especially its use in South Korea and China and Singapore, which seemingly compared to the United States, where we're all based, has been potentially more able to flatten the curve, which we all know as a term now. So I'd love to kind of start off with that discussion of where do you see this balance between public safety and civil liberties, especially around AI surveillance tools. So Renee, I'll kick it off with you.
All right. So I would say for me, these are really unprecedented, but very, very scary times. And what we're seeing is that AI, because of its speed and its pervasiveness, has the power to really make a difference right now in real time, because lives are being lost. And I think every day we're looking at the count on the news, and it really, really is a very devastating time. But at the same time, what we're seeing is that the countries like China and South Korea, now Israel and Iran, many of them have taken some really draconian approaches when it comes to contact tracing and monitoring. And while some of these may be very effective, what we're seeing is that systems integration between public health and national security. And many of the strategies that are being used are counterterrorism strategies, law enforcement strategies, and national security strategies. And we've got to be really careful about that, because when this is all over on the other side, we may realize that our human rights and our civil liberties may have been sacrificed for us to just flatten the curve and slow the spread. So it's really a precarious situation that we're in, and it's about finding balance and equilibrium within the context, of course, of accountability, transparency, and ethics.
Well, let's continue on that, and for both of you. I'm also taking down notes. I do have my pen here. So to that point, Renee, when you're talking about a hopefully temporary, let's imagine this goes on 6 months, worst case scenario, or I guess it could be even worst case scenarios, but let's say 6 months to a year. These are temporary, in the grand scheme of things, a temporary problem. How do you think we ensure that it stays a kind of like a temporary fix? It seems like one of the concerns that a lot of people have right now is that, to your point, these temporary solutions could have long-lasting kind of impacts. So I'm curious to learn maybe a little bit more about how we can ensure that we're trying to kind of use a scalpel as opposed to something that could have more serious consequences with not having like sunset provisions and things like that.
Well, I think we've got to realize that right now it's all about the data, because data is what we're using to slow the spread and to flatten the curve and to create the models that are so critical to coming up with those public health and public safety strategies. So we've got to understand the importance of data, but we've also got to know in a crisis like a pandemic, oftentimes it exposes our vulnerabilities. And so many things happen in the back door that we're not seeing. So right now it's like a mad grab for data among some of the big tech companies. We're seeing that, right? It's a power grab. It's like data firepower. This entire pandemic has been framed like a war. So we've got to start the conversation, and we've got to hold these companies accountable, because what we see oftentimes in a crisis is that many of us, because we want to bring the debt count down, are willing to sacrifice some of our liberties to get things going. But we've got to start the questions, we've got to pose the questions, and we've got to understand while it is about public harm, and while it's about individual protection, and while it's about social regulation, and it's about social distancing, it's also about finding that balance between privacy and protection and public safety. And it's really important for us in this field of ethics to really call to account, or really to hold these tech companies or these leaders accountable for the decisions they're going to make with our data. How are they going to use it? How are they going to dispose it? How are they going to use it after? Are they going to use it for power? Are they going to use it to monitor us, after this is done? So those are some of the questions that we've really got to answer.
Okay. So Reid, where would you go with that? Because it seems like a lot of this is really, how do we have a somewhat rational discussion with what I think everybody would admit is a very emotional time period, right? I'm affected. You're, I imagine, affected. A lot of us are very emotional, which then tilts towards more irrational types of feelings. We've obviously seen through tragedies throughout our American history how a lot of times that does lead to very serious, long-lasting legal changes and other kind of etiquette changes. So where would you take that conversation, Reid?
So look, you're absolutely right. It's a scary time. On the one hand, we have the fear of the virus itself and the damage it can do. And that kind of feeling makes us want to say, all right, look, just take our data, do what you got to do, just solve the problem. And then we're at a place where we didn't realize we were going, which is the complete erosion of our right to privacy. On the other hand, you don't want to be so panicked about being tracked, so panicked about your data being collected and used that you don't allow any of it, and so the pandemic only worsens, right? So we want to avoid, both the rock and the hard place of panic of being overly surveilled, and the fear of the pandemic not being approached properly. Now, I wouldn't say, though, that we need to, and I think, Renee, you're absolutely right, that part of the issue here is that you called it, I think, a mad grab for data. Yeah, that's exactly right. I'd say it's the Wild West. There are no regulations, there are no rules, and no one knows what's going on. That said, I don't think that the right thing to do is to raise a bunch of questions, to ask them, as it were, what are you doing with your data? What do you plan to do with it? How are you handling it, etc. We know the answers to those questions. We know that at the end of the day, if they have the opportunity to, they'll figure out how to continue to leverage that data to drive their bottom line. That's a given. Government will use it to increase their power as well, because power usually seeks more power. So we know the answers to those questions. I think rather what we need to do is sort of galvanize around a set of conditions under which we permit them to do what they're doing with data. So it's to put it slightly differently, a political theorist, Adolph Reed Jr., brilliant guy, he doesn't like the anti-racism movement because racism is too abstract. He said, in the civil rights movement, they weren't fighting against racism, they were fighting for specific policies like desegregation. Similarly, I think here the fight is not against surveillance, it's for particular policies. And if we don't galvanize, rally around a certain set of concrete policies that give them the control they need to do the job of curbing the pandemic, while also giving us sufficient control such that we're going to give up our right to privacy, if we don't do that, we're going to get steamrolled.
And it seems like I'm also monitoring some of the questions. We are getting a couple questions related to the conversation, Reid and Renee, that we're having. One of them is specifically talking about concrete steps. What concrete steps can a regular person take? So, for example, obviously a lot of controversy right now about Zoom and privacy. I'm just curious of what type of advice would you give for just a regular person who's watching, or just in general, about how they can maintain a certain level of privacy, whereas at the same time, obviously everybody is concerned with playing their part in trying to reduce this public safety issue.
Well, I would say it's really a question of knowing the sites that you're on and looking at the privacy protections of that site, as well as, I think with many of us, we see these things and we just click and we say, I agree, and we click right down to the end and we're not looking at what we're clicking. I think we've got to really look at that, because what we have seen, and history shows us many times, and particularly with technology, that whole question of forced consent. Because when you think about it, many people at a time of crisis, and particularly now where your loved ones are at risk, where you are at risk, I think we are willing, and when you're in that situation of life and death, you are willing to sign anything that may say, you're going to get health care or you're going to be attended to if we are able to use your data in the future. So it's a time when people are not thinking. So when I said, Reid, let's ask the question, many of us in the realm of AI and data ethics, we know what the next steps are supposed to be, but it needs to be a public conversation, because many people don't know. Many people don't understand what's going on and how things are going to look like at the end of the tunnel. So I'm thinking, if you're just a citizen right now, there are lots of AI sort of related data scams that are happening now, and there's more cybersecurity protection that needs to be done, because people are going to try to scam you. People use chaos and pandemics and these issues to profit. So you've got to be aware of that, but you've also got to pay attention to some of these other issues that are happening just in real time. To me, it's about public education, and it's about public awareness. So while we are doing the public education when it comes to public health, I think from a data and AI perspective, we've got to do some awareness there as well for citizens.
And Reid, actually, before sorry.
Yeah,
please go ahead.
So I think I have a slide maybe that when we talk about the details of it, it turns page. In answer to the question, what can I do as an individual? of me. My general view is you can't do anything. It's not in your power. You don't have the resources. You don't have the power. You don't have the time. It's not, on my privacy. That's not how this is. The only way that you're going to get your privacy is if we collectively fight for our privacy. That's the only way. So I don't think this is about each individual doing their part independently of other people doing their part in the way that some people think about recycling, for instance. I think this only has an impact. We only move the needle on this if we don't think about what can I do, in my small sphere, and think instead, what can we do in the larger sphere if we expand that sphere by combining our efforts into around a single set of goals.
Yeah, but it comes back to knowledge as well. When we think about AI is still relatively new. That's why we're doing so much work on the front of diversity, equity, and inclusion in AI. A lot of people still don't grasp that concept. So to mix AI now with national security and public health and your life at this time, it's really giving people a lot to think about. So that's why I'm saying, while the collective is critical, the individual has got to build his or her knowledge as well at this time. Just as we've been building our knowledge when it comes to public when it comes to public health, or when it comes to social distancing, or all the things that we need to do to slow the spread or flatten the curve.
So we do have a few questions that we're going to incorporate pretty soon. So thank you for that, coming in from a few different locations. But Ray, to follow up on that, you mentioned kind of having these public discussions. I'm curious about how you imagine us as a society having these kind of hard conversations, given that everybody right now is working from home. It's very hard to congregate. You see even Congress really with their own social distancing. What would you like to see happen in your ideal scenario?
Well, I think for me, we started the conversation here. More and more people are using these types of platforms, live stream, Zoom, whatever it is, to have more and more conversations. The same ways we are in our families, and now we are stuck in our communities, relatively in our communities. Many people are using these WhatsApp chat groups to stay connected, to stay safe. So I think people are sort of connected more through technology and understanding the power of that. But I think when it comes to the big tech companies, we've also got to understand that they've been the ones who've been really driving the conversation about ethics in AI, right? Fairness, accountability, transparency, and ethics. But I think now is when we've got to call them on it, because they have got to have a duty of care. So while many people may not be paying attention to what's happening in the boardrooms or what's happening in Congress or what's happening right now, because we're trying to stay alive, we need to know that, we're still part of the discussion, and we need to ensure that they're doing the right thing, because it's about good faith as well. This is the space that we're in right now.
All right, so we, there's a lot of.
I actually don't think.
Go ahead, Reid.
I wouldn't frame it as a discussion. I'd frame it as an antagonistic relationship for the most part. It's not as though we have, it's not two equals coming together. It's large corporations trying to do whatever they can to push their bottom line, and they'll listen to you, and they'll nod their head, and they'll say yes, 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 and then they'll put out a public statement that says, we really care about ethics, and here are our principles, yada, yada. But until they actually do it's not just words on paper, but it's concrete process, practice they can point to, that what they do on a systematic level to exhaustively identify as best they can the kinds of ethical risks that are involved. They're not doing anything. And so that's why we have to say, I'm not looking for a discussion from you. Here's what I want. I want you to understand that you are not allowed to use our data for any other purpose but fighting this pandemic. Any data you collect, you can't share it with any other departments within your own organization. Google, right? For instance, you've got hundreds of departments, and if you share it with some other department, they're going to use it for all sorts of reasons or for all sorts of purposes. You're not allowed to sell it to any other company or share it with any other company, because they're going to use it to drive and or protect their bottom line. You're not allowed to share it with other government agencies. So for instance, you can't share it with ICE, who might use it to track down people they suspect of being in the country illegally. So I wouldn't say it's a discussion. I'd say it's a set of demands that we need to make. And if we don't make those demands and fight hard for them, then again, we'll just get sort of, we'll get nodding heads and no results.
Well, we did also get a question about data privacy legislation and the kind of opinions about that and where you see that headed. So are there any thoughts about data privacy, specifically in the US, or data privacy legislation?
Reid, you want to take that one?
Sure. So, you know, I mean, so first I should say, I'm not a lawyer.
But you're on the board of the company.
Yeah, well, I'm not on the board, but yeah, I'm on an advisory board for EY. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know what's going to happen with regulation. No one does. But to the extent that you do have regulation, a lot of it is highly impacted by what the corporate lobbyists want that regulation to look like. So, you know, regulation could be a saving grace on the condition that, to Renee's point, the public is sufficiently educated such that they know what regulations they ought to be pushing for. Because if, you know, the politicians go to Microsoft, Google, Facebook and say, hey, listen, we'd love your input. What do you think? And they're going to tell them X, Y, and Z, where X, Y, and Z isn't too disastrous for their bottom line. And then they tell the public, hey, this is what they're going to do. If the public doesn't know what they should be pushing for in the first place, then the public will simply acquiesce out of ignorance. So regulations don't mean anything unless the public has a meaningful contribution to what those are. And at the moment, we don't have any of that. And so at the moment, I would expect very little, except with, you know, rare exceptions for very, very liberal, very progressive states like California, where you have CCPA, but that's not yet national.
We also had kind of a clarification type of question, Renee. I think this was aimed at you. I think earlier you had said, you know, kind of like your reliance on reliable sources of knowledge around COVID-19 and AI ethics types of issues. I think the question was getting at, what do you see as those reliable sources, hinting at that there might be a lot of conflicting information, specifically around COVID-19, and it does.
Okay, so I guess they're talking about disinformation and the disinformation campaign that's already spreading. I think you've got to understand, it comes back to media literacy. I think for me, one of the things that I always do, I think being a former journalist, is I always look at three sources. So if there's something that I see, I try to make sure if it's in the news, it's in the news in three main sources. But when it comes to, you've got to look at the sites, I think, that are other sites that are dealing with the pandemic. You want to look at the CDC, you may want to look at the WHO, but you've also got to know how to dissect information and really how to make sense out of nonsense. Some of the things is, of course, a lot of fake news, a lot of hype, a lot of panic. This is the time, I keep saying, where we need empathy, compassion, and kindness, but we also need solid information. So you've got to look at your information sources. I don't know where people find their information, but what I'm saying is it really calls for media literacy, and there are many agencies out there, from journalism to data and ethics, to many of them who are putting information out there for you to know how to look for that information, what to take from it, and how to use it. And then, of course, don't overload with the information. I've stopped watching TV for a few days right now because I just needed a break. You know, it's the death count, it's the amount of, you know, it's just too much. It's really too much for me. So you've got to take a break from the information as well. Part of your mental health survival, you know, sort of strategy.
Yeah, and I think that goes to the earlier point. I think we're all trying to survive and take that self-care into consideration. It is extremely important. We do also have another question similar to, Reid, what you were talking about with data privacy from Joe Toscano, who's also been involved with the ethicist human community. He said, or he is saying, I think we spend too much time talking about what data can be used for, but what about mandating or a prohibited use policy, which forces companies to state what they absolutely will not use data for? So what are our thoughts on that?
I don't think any company is going to do that. As Reid said, it's always about the bottom line, you know. People never really spend time to read the fine print. Companies are out there to make money. That's what they are, the data companies. And now they're leveraging in areas because the pandemic, of course, has created different avenues now where people want to get into. Healthcare is the biggest one right now, right? AI healthcare. How many ways that we could use AI? Everything right now is sort of AI centric. So I don't think they are going to say, what are we not going to use? I think they're going to try to push the envelope, because we know at this present time, there's still many loopholes when it comes to AI, particularly in the realm of ethics, diversity, equity, and inclusion. We've seen, particularly in the criminal justice system, which gives us an excellent sort of microscope to look at some of the risks that we have seen, you know, those zombie predictions and those opaque algorithms that exist in that space. So they're not going to tell us what they're not going to use our data for. They're going to hope we continue sleeping while they keep pushing the envelope and keep dancing through those loopholes to really profit. We've seen it before.
Okay. Well, we did also get
okay,
go ahead, Reid.
I wanted to say something about Joe's question. So if you ask a company, what are you going to do or not do with it? When you ask that question, you're thereby implying that it's within their control to do this or do that. No, or not to do this or not to do that. And my own view is something like, when we think about privacy, we shouldn't be thinking about something like an on-off switch or whether people can see stuff. To my mind, what privacy should amount to is who has control over the data. That to me strikes me as the fundamental question with regards to all of this. Who has control? Now, if you say, hey, tell us what you're going to do with the data, you've already implicitly relinquished your control, because you've asked them what they are going to do. On the other hand, it's around what kind of have over our data control do we have over our data? Then we're not thinking about what should their internal policies be. It should be about what's ours. The end. So
no, that is good. So I guess another question that came up earlier was dealing with the trade-offs that a lot of countries are facing. It was specifically asking about South Korea that has made a trade-off. I think I'm kind of paraphrasing the earlier comment, but it was dealing with seemingly making a trade-off of, hey, if you want to be safe and free, then we need to be surveilled. Where do you see some of that trade-off, and then specifically where do you see that going here in the United States?
Well, I don't think it's going to be going really far in the United States, because I think the conversation or the action has already started when it comes to that question of data ethics. The South Korea model, again, they did maximum containment, and they decided that they were going to do the contact tracing. They were going to combine, of course, your customs and immigration information with your health information, with your credit card information, with your banking information. And they were really going to, that's where I'm saying, when you see that systems integration between counterterrorism and national security and law enforcement strategy. So yes, they may have reduced it at what price is that they saved lives, but now I think the question there for a lot of people is, what about human rights? You know, what about our civil liberties? Is it that governments are going to use this to monitor us forever? We've been reading the articles, we've been seeing the research, and they're saying, I mean, if they can test our temperature now from the phone, they want to design all of these things. They could also test where we are politically, where we're not politically, So it's how are you going to, because right now we're seeing the data could do just about everything. So it's, yes, we want to use it right now in real time to flatten the curve and slow the spread. We've got to do that. I always say that for me, AI is an extraordinary tool. It is a tool that can do so much when combined, particularly with healthcare, but it's also a tool that is very deadly when combined with national security and counterterrorism. So if you look at Israel, just for some comparison, you would realize the containment strategy for COVID-19 in Israel is being led by an intelligence agency, like their Secret Service. They're doing the monitoring. Is that only for good health? Or could that be for something else?
And Renee, actually, to follow up, we have a question kind of specific to what you were saying. It said, Renee, you referenced diversity, equity, and inclusion. Can you give an example on how to leverage diversity, equity, and inclusion when it comes to privacy and public awareness?
All right, well, definitely. So if we look at what happened in China, okay, or what happened in South Korea, where they started to reveal people's information as a form of public safety and public health. And what they started to see is where people went, what people were doing, people's sexuality, people's differences were starting to be revealed. People were being victimized. People's lives were being threatened on the internet. People were being shamed and stigmatized. So this is why diversity, equity, and inclusion are so critical to privacy, because whether or not I'm in quarantine, or whether I'm not in quarantine, or you think I should be, or people in my community may want to know who in the community may have COVID-19. Do they need to know my sexuality? Do they need to know my politics? Do they need to know my religion? Do they need to know all those other things that the data is collecting? So that's why it's important.
Reid, do you have any additional thoughts on that?
No, I think that was exactly right. I think Renee and I are on the same page.
Good. Well, there is a really fascinating question that just came in that I think will be important, especially dovetails since we are holding this with All Tech is Human, and one of the ideas or ethos baked into All Tech is Human is that we're trying to expand the conversation of people who are involved outside of just technologists and really outside of the walls of kind of academia. So this is a question from Cheryl. She says, I think these are important discussions, however, sometimes done in a vacuum. We have these discussions outside of technical experts represented. How do we better integrate insights from AI professionals and big tech reps to provide greater insights into how they're thinking about these issues we're raising? So how can we kind of take a big tent strategy with this? How can we expand this conversation outside of probably the self-selection that would take place of people watching this? How do we get this across all different populations?
So I'll give you one suggestion. So you could try talking to the tech companies directly. Very difficult. You could write blog posts and newspaper articles, yada yada. There's been no shortage of those. That's not moving them. But you could leverage existing political powers to make it happen. So for instance, the ACLU is a phenomenally powerful fights for civil rights. As far as I can see, absolutely about data privacy. I get emails from the ACLU all the time. I'm especially getting them right now. Not one of them. I mean, they're talking about important issues about civil rights, people being unjustifiably detained, etc. Very important issues. But on their website, when it talks about how do we respect civil rights while addressing the epidemic, they don't mention data privacy or surveillance at all. In any of their emails I've received, I've never gotten it. So here's one thing that everyone can do: start writing to the ACLU and get this on their radar, because the ACLU has the power to get it on the radar for both government officials and executives at tech companies. They've got that kind of power. They have that reach. They have that bullhorn. And right now, there's nothing coming from them. So I don't think it's anyway. So that's my suggestion. Reach out to those powerful organizations who are people and push them to push the issue.
Okay.
I think for me, I would look at it this way. All of the big tech companies are funding nonprofits and university programs that deal with AI ethics and data ethics. Some of the stakeholders that they support all deal with AI ethics. So they already have a relationship with many of the major nonprofit organizations that are looking at this question. So I think it's for all those individuals who represent big tech, they represent academia, they represent industry, who are on these boards, to call them on it, because they have a direct telephone line to these individuals. So every big tech company has created some sort of board or some sort of nonprofit that looks at fairness, accountability, transparency, and ethics. We have got to ask those people who are on those advisory councils to call them on it. It's about good faith. It's about duty of care. It's about due diligence. It's about those checks and balances. So they've got to do the job that they're there for, particularly now in a time of crisis.
I agree with you. The reason why, though, I think that won't be, I mean, I don't think any one strategy is sufficient. Obviously, you need multiple strategies, multiple tactics, etc. The problem with all of those people is that they are, so to speak, on the take, right? They're funded by those companies, and those companies can choose to withdraw funding, and then they lose their title, they lose their salary. So it takes, in some way, even though they're being paid to research this stuff, right? They're not being paid to stop the gears of the machine. And if they try to stop the gears of the machine, then they might not like the response by the funders in the first place. So I think that there's a way in which, when you ask them to do that, you are absolutely right to ask them to do that. But I think we shouldn't expect a tremendous amount of compliance, because it takes a kind of act of courage for them to do what ideally we think of as their job.
Good point.
For the ACLU, it doesn't take the kind of courage, because it's just, they're not funded by those companies. So they can do what they want.
Renee, and I think this will be a really kind of interesting question that might have strong opinions. But Renee, you mentioned duty of care. We just got a really interesting question, which seems to be leading to some debate in the comments. And then also, I believe Kansu had tweeted it to us. She said, "Why should private companies be involved in the fight against a pandemic if there are no incentives? Or in other words, what are the incentives you are imagining? I don't think, quote unquote, duty of care works for corporations who do not have such a duty." So it's kind of backing that up a little bit. And, in other words, is there a duty of care for big tech to fight this pandemic?
No, there's got to be a duty of care. That's who we are, citizens. Big tech companies are also citizens, right? It's our civic duty, our civic responsibility, as it is our civic duty right now to socially isolate or to physically isolate and stay at home, because we're all part of that fight, right? To reduce this pandemic, to flatten the curve. I think it's all about social responsibility. And it's also a relationship about trust as well. There is a relationship between tech, data, and citizens that includes a whole lot of trust, right? And it's also about accountability. So they do have a duty of care. You have companies right now that are doing this sort of grab to see who comes up with a vaccine, right? To me, who owns the vaccine, who developed the vaccine sort of like owns the world right now, right? Because this is where we're at. So there is a duty of care. There's always that duty of care. There's that responsibility, because I think it comes back to good faith. And these companies speak of themselves as good citizens. So many of them are donating masks and creating ventilators and doing all the things that we want or we need at this moment. So they do have a duty of care, and they know that. But what we also know, pandemics or crises create the opportunity to make money. And there's some companies who are just going to do that at the same time.
And then I guess continuing on that, we just got a kind of a follow-up question from Helen. So do you think this pandemic is a fundamental shift for big tech, or is it really just business as usual with a twist?
Well, that's what we don't know.
Yeah. Okay.
That's what we don't know. And that's why we're having this discussion, because we know these are unprecedented times. And we know unprecedented times call for unprecedented measures. But what we don't know is what is going to be facing us at the end when we get out of this situation. That's what we don't know. But what we also know that history teaches us is that you can't turn back the clock. And we don't want to get in a position where we can turn that clock back when this the crises or the immediacy of this crisis has been subsided.
So let me, there's no question of whether they have a duty of care. They do. I also don't believe that they are actually guided by it. They might be acting, if you like, in accordance with it, but not guided by it. So, my wife before the pandemic said, "Stop spending so much money on lunch," and last night I said, "Aren't you happy I'm not spending so much money on lunch?" Of course, it's because I can't go out. So I'm acting in accordance with her guidelines, but I'm not, if you like, I'm not guided by them. So the difference between acting in accordance with something, a principle or a duty, and acting and being guided by it. The tech companies might be acting in accordance with the duty of care, but they're not being guided by it. And here's my reason for saying so. If they were guided by it, then they would do more than just help. They would also be phenomenally transparent about, for instance, what they're doing with all the data they're collecting. So they would have come out and said, we are here to help. We have a duty to care. We're going to do X, Y, and Z. And to be clear, we will do nothing to personally profit from this. Any data and surveillance that we need to engage in to curb the pandemic will be deleted, returned to the users, never used for profit, never transferred, never sold. They didn't say any of that. And if you are acting under duty of care, then that's the kind of thing that you do and then tell everyone. The fact that they're not saying those things already speaks volumes. Why are they doing what they are doing? Why are they acting in accordance with the duty of care to a limited extent, if not being guided by it? Because it would be a PR disaster if they didn't. Right? So number one, we don't know what financial arrangement they have with the government. Say, we want to do this work, we want to help out, but look, we've got all the engineers on payroll. You're going to pay us so that we can pay our people, and maybe there's a little bit of profit in there as well. And then if they want to be able to say, look how much we're doing, aren't we phenomenal? That's PR. And then they don't want to be in PR crisis mode when someone goes to, say, Google and says, well, Microsoft and Facebook did this and that. How come you didn't do anything? They don't want that bad press. So there's very strong PR incentive to do the things that they're doing. But I believe if they were actually guided by the duty of care, we'd get a lot more transparency from them.
And then to follow up, we're getting a ton of comments, questions. I think some strongly held beliefs and arguments on both sides. If I kind of bring together some of the comments, Antonio from coworker.org, who's participated also in All Tech is Human, he's asking kind of about duty of care and some of the controversies around how big tech or has been treating its tech workers. Does that get in the way of this kind of trust that would be needed to say that big tech is going to have this duty of care and that they're going to do the right thing, given some of these past controversies? That's also similar to a question that Christy had about some of the past issues that big tech has had. So I'm curious of what you think about our perceptions towards big tech, given some of the controversies of recent years.
Well, go ahead, Reid. You take this one.
Well, so I'm not sure that I fully understand the question yet. So will the way in which tech companies are currently treating their employees affect their reputations?
Yeah, it's basically, I guess to frame it a little better, big tech has had kind of a sullied reputation in a lot of ways because of how they've treated their workers. Is that going to affect a lot of this conversation right now, where the general public is trying to decide how much they trust big tech?
I don't know. I don't think anyone at the moment really cares that much. I mean, I'm not saying that they should, but I just don't think at the moment most Americans are wondering, "Oh, I hope the tech workers are okay." They barely ever think that. And especially now, they don't think that.
Well, I don't know, though, because there is that recent debate around Amazon workers who now are realizing that we're heavily dependent. I mean, a lot of us, right, we're relatively white collar, dependent on a lot of other individuals to drop off, groceries, things of that nature. So I think it has brought into focus our kind of reliance. But to kind of pivot a little bit on that.
I think it's important. I think trust is critical. And I think the kind of trust you have before a crisis is really important. So if you don't trust the companies before a crisis, you're definitely not going to trust them during a crisis or expect them to make the right decisions for you. So trust is critical. And trust is also the basis of the relationship we're having right now, because we are not there. We are not in the meetings. We're not in the task groups that are now being sort of corralled to treat with this pandemic, which has to be done in real time. And what we see is when we need to get things done in real time, particularly when it comes back to life or death, sometimes trust is not high on the agenda, because some of the things that may need to be implemented may compromise trust and accountability and transparency. But this is the whole question again. Some of the countries have instituted sort of emergency powers, right? So they have state of emergencies, and we know during those you relinquish or your rights are suspended. So when there's a suspension of rights, or where there's that readiness to relinquish some of those civil liberties, of course, trust sort of gets out of the way. So trust is really important when it comes to many of those tech companies. I think we've seen the best of them and we've seen the worst of them. And I think we've got to live with them, because this is the world we're in now. And I think many of them may be using this pandemic for some sort of salvation for themselves.
Well, to that point, though, recently in the media, we've seen a lot of discussion around, quote unquote, has COVID-19 killed the tech lash, based on the idea that compared to pre-COVID-19, it seems like the work that big tech has done has achieved more kudos. It could also be because we're heavily reliant right now on a lot of these digital tools. So I'm curious about that question then. Do you think that because Renee, you are talking about kind of our distrust sometimes towards big tech, do you think that what we're going through now is going to change our relationship with big tech?
I think it's going to put us in a more vulnerable position. I think we are going to be disempowered just a little more. I do believe that. I think the heavy reliance on big tech is going to get big tech even bigger, because so much is going to be invested in AI strategies, particularly when it comes for surveillance. Even after we've been able to flatten the curve, it's still going to be there. And this is why I'm saying that we've got to step forward and really create some sort of maybe movement, some action that we've got to ensure that ethics takes priority. Because right now we're all just trying to get out of this tunnel. We're all just trying to get out of it alive. And when we get out of it, what's the world waiting for us on the other side? And that's what we've got to think about.
So, yeah, I agree with all of that. I want to add that, it's far too early to say that the tech lash is dead, right? There's just some other pressing matters. I mean, I care a lot about, I don't know, getting to work, but if my kid is sick, I'm going to run and go to the school to pick up my kid. It doesn't mean that I don't care about work anymore. Where it's like we're experiencing a crisis. So the idea that our prior long-standing and growing concerns are somehow have just evaporated, there doesn't seem to me any reason to believe that. The other thing that I want to mention is that there's one thing that hasn't come up yet, which I think is going to be a big issue. And it's related to backlash to tech. And it's also not just tech companies, but also our employers. So in the context of talking about the shelter and home orders and everyone working from home as a result of the pandemic and surveillance and ethics, one thing that's worth mentioning here, not just mentioning, but stressing, is the level of surveillance that employers will perform with their own employees from home, and scrambling to figure out how do we make sure our people are still being sufficiently productive. They're going to deploy a ton of surveillance tools, AI tools in their software, et cetera, to monitor their employees. They're going to start collecting metrics around what you're doing online. They're going to use those metrics to figure out whether you get fired or laid off or get a bonus or promoted or whatever. So don't think that the surveillance is limited to big tech and government when it comes to COVID-19. COVID-19 is as a result of causing people to work from home, is also going to cause employers to increasingly surveil their employees in a way that employees have increasingly less control over.
That's an important point, yeah.
So kind of with that, Reid, we also got another question from Helen, where she said, here's a generalization. Many individual AI developers inside big tech care deeply about, quote unquote, doing the right thing, but it breaks down at the whole. How would you know if there's changes? Would either of you like to take that question?
I didn't hear it. How do we know with what change?
How do we know if doing the right thing? I think it's also kind of getting at the idea of how do we know if something is altruistic versus solely done because it is business savvy, that it's trying to capitalize on the current moment?
Well, I think from a diversity, equity, and inclusion perspective, it's so critical to have those issues during the design process. And, it's something that I speak about a lot. Who's doing the designing? Who's at the table when these designs are being created? Because we've seen in criminal justice, we've seen in healthcare, we've seen in predictive policing, how discrimination and racism and sexism and ageism, how all of these things are able to sneak through the back door of design optimization. So we can't ever lose focus on that. And now we've got to even really have a laser focus on that, because so many things are happening now at the same time and in real time, and not everything can get our attention, because right now our attention is the preservation of life and saving life and really protecting ourselves, our families, our communities, and our countries right now when it comes to the coronavirus.
And then I think for our final question, then we'll just kind of get to kind of like a closing, if you will. We had a really interesting one that it's taking us a little bit out of kind of the tech conversation and more about ethics. And it came through us from Jay on Twitter. He said, putting aside the unicorn of artificial intelligence, what specific AI application do you think is sufficiently advanced to aid moral judgments that need to be made in regards to COVID-19, and should it? And then specifically to add on to this question, I'm kind of thinking, I know, Reid, you did a discussion around ventilators and some of the kind of trolley problem types of questions with that. I'm curious, because it does seem like a lot of us are making these deep ethical decisions. We're debating whether or not we should be wearing masks, who should have masks, what if I have masks? Do you think there's anything that's coming out AI wise or tech wise in general that's going to aid us in making these very difficult ethical decisions?
I don't think anything like that is going to happen anytime soon. We must appreciate when it comes to augmented intelligence, there must also be collective intelligence to ensure that there's informed decision making. So you've got to have human intelligence and artificial intelligence working at the same time. I think what we are seeing that needs to make us pay attention is recently, maybe a few days ago, I read some research where AI is now being used in the ICU to determine who gets a ventilator or who's intubated, as opposed to who doesn't live. And that is a really serious one, because they're saying it's really about efficiency again, and it's about expediency at a time when there's just too many people in the ICU. And to use AI to now make a decision on who lives or who dies, we've got to really pay attention to what is happening there. So I don't think there's any AI instrument or system right now that looks at ethics or probably looks at that question of how we behave ethically, and to ensure that behavior is what would be considered some sort of a best practice. I don't think that has been really invented yet, although I know there are companies who are working on assessment tools that look at ethics and, of course, a diversity, equity, and inclusion. But I think we've also got to be looking at how AI is being used right now to determine who gets healthcare as opposed to who doesn't, and who gets that sort of attention.
So I as far as I know, there's no AI who's making that is making this kind of decision. That's not surprising, because at the moment, neither physicians nor hospital administrators know how to make these decisions. Medical ethicists have talked about this for a long time. I've taught courses on this, in fact. So look, here's a way in which AI arguably makes sense to be used in the following way. It's fairly common for people to think that what ought to play a role in how you ration care, that is to say, how you figure out how to distribute care given limited resources, or that there's more people in need than there are resources to take care of all those people. It's pretty standard to think that one thing you want to do is either maximize quantity of lives saved or maximize quantity of years saved. So does that make sense? Now, obviously, if you're going to try to either maximize quantity of lives or quantity of years saved, then you're going to have a pretty good idea about what's the likelihood of this person living if we provide this kind of treatment, or how much longer should we expect them to live given their other conditions if we give them this treatment and they survive it. And it might be the case that there's a decent, equal to or better than human AI that either has been or will be developed that will help with those prognoses. And that's, if you like, a kind of empirical claim. It's not an ethical claim. It's an empirical claim about what's the likelihood or the probability of this person benefiting from this treatment, and in what ways would they benefit. Now, then taking that and letting it feed into ethical deliberations strikes me as perfectly appropriate. But that's utterly distinct from the AI making the ethical decision itself.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's, Reid, I think that's a good way to kind of wrap up some of our conversation. So I think, one, I want to thank everybody for participating and from really having these great questions. We want to continue this. So if you have any ideas, please reach out to us at hello@alltechishuman.org. We'd love to do this frequently. Again, I also want to give a big thank you to Renee and Reid for participating.
Thank you.
We really do value your time and expertise. So I think finally, we'll just go to both of you to kind of say where people who are tuning in right now or maybe watch later can get in contact with you, and then any type of final statement on this issue that you might have. So Renee, we'll start with you.
Sure. Of course, people always get in touch with me on LinkedIn, on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or on the Columbia University website. You can get my email there as well. For me, I'm just going to tell people, these are really scary times. So many of us have been impacted, and so many of us are really, for me, the most troubling thing is that we've been denied an opportunity to really grieve and to be there with the people we love. So my thing is just about now staying safe and staying healthy, and just hoping that all of this could be over and done with, and we could really hug and touch and kiss the people that we love really soon, because all of this means nothing if we don't have health and strength and life. Well said.
Well said. Reid.
So you can find me at virtueconsultants.com. I'm on LinkedIn, and I post a lot of articles and posts there, and I write up a lot about this particular issue. You can also just email me at reid@virtueconsultants.com. Always happy to chat. My big takeaway is that I don't care about your health or safety or anything like that, obviously. I'm just kidding. But look, so my big takeaway is that I think that this requires political activism. I don't think that we take it on our individual shoulders. I think we have to figure out how to work together, figure out what exactly we want out of our government and big tech companies. And then we need to collectively fight for those things. If we don't put our heads together and we don't push other organizations to push these things to the front, like the ACLU, then we're just not going to see the needle move.
Thank you. Yeah, well said. So again, we want to thank both Reid and Renee for this conversation, and everybody tuning in for your great comments. So thank you both.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
please stay safe.
Stay safe.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.